Welcome, my friends, to another journey through time on this channel. Tonight, we are sailing into a story that has puzzled historians, archaeologists, and storytellers alike for centuries. It is the tale of the Viking colonies in Greenland, settlements that clung to the edges of the known world for nearly 500 years before fading into silence. Imagine the mystery. For generations, these hardy Norse farmers built homes, raised families, and carved out lives in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And yet, one day, they were simply gone. No triumphant farewell, no lasting records, only ruins, bones, and whispered traces of what once was. Why did they vanish? Was it climate, conflict, or something more elusive? That is the question we will unravel together tonight. Before we dive deep into ice, sagas, and archaeological clues, let me gently remind you, if you enjoy drifting off with history's great mysteries, consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps keep these stories alive, and it means we can keep exploring the forgotten corners of the past together. Now, dim the lights, settle into a comfortable position, and let us step softly onto the icy shores of medieval Greenland. The year is around 985 after Christ. A bold and exiled Viking named Erik the Red is steering westward from Iceland. He has been outlawed for killings back home, but rather than fade into disgrace, he seizes the moment. Rumors had circulated of land far across the sea, icy and formidable, but habitable. Erik sails into those waters, sights the great frozen coastlines, and names it Greenland. It was, many suggest, a marketing trick. Greenland sounded fertile and inviting compared to Iceland, though in truth it was a world of stark cliffs, glaciers, and brief summers. Still, Erik returned to Iceland with tales of this new land, urging settlers to join him. He spoke of rich pastures and opportunity, and his words stirred the restless hearts of farmers eager for land. Within a few years, ships carried hundreds of men, women, children, and livestock across the treacherous North Atlantic. They came not as raiders, the way Vikings are so often remembered, but as colonists, as families determined to plant roots. Two main settlements were founded: the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq, and the western settlement farther north near present-day Nuuk. Together, these communities would endure for centuries, at their peak numbering perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people. Picture it: longhouses made of stone and turf, sheep and cattle grazing on narrow pastures, smoke curling into the cold air. Life was harsh but organized. The Norse brought with them their social structures, their laws, their church, and their sense of connection to the wider medieval world. They traded with Europe, exporting walrus ivory, furs, and hides in exchange for iron, timber, and luxury goods. A bishop's seat was even established in Greenland, with a cathedral of stone that still stands in ruins today at Garðar. This was no temporary camp. It was a society, a world transplanted onto the edge of the Arctic. And yet, the story we must follow is not one of permanence, but of disappearance. By the 1400s, the Western settlement was gone, abandoned without ceremony. By the mid-15th century, the Eastern settlement too had vanished, leaving only silent ruins. The last written record we have is a church entry from 1408, describing a wedding at Hvalsey, the best-preserved Norse ruin in Greenland. After that, nothing. No more records, no more voices, only silence. So, what happened? Theories abound, and none alone can fully explain the collapse. Climate change is the first suspect. Around the 1300s, the world entered what is known as the Little Ice Age. Summers shortened, winters grew harsher, and Greenland's fragile pastures could no longer sustain cattle and crops the way they once had. The sea ice expanded, making voyages to Iceland and Norway more perilous, cutting the settlers off from trade and vital supplies. Imagine waiting for ships that never arrived, watching your livestock starve, and seeing each year grow colder than the last. Survival would have demanded adaptation, but the Norse clung stubbornly to their European way of life. This brings us to another theory: cultural rigidity. The Norse in Greenland were farmers at heart. They raised cattle and sheep, they grew hay, and they sought to maintain the identity of a European farming society. Yet they were surrounded by Inuit peoples, the Thule culture, who had mastered Arctic survival with kayaks, harpoons, and seal hunting. Archaeological evidence shows little sign that the Norse adopted Inuit techniques. They fished less than might be expected, they resisted changing their diets, and they held tightly to traditions even as the environment turned against them. Was it pride? Was it the grip of culture and religion? The sense that to live like Inuit was to abandon their identity? Perhaps both. Trade, too, played a role. For centuries, the Greenland colonies thrived by exporting walrus ivory, prized in Europe for luxury items before elephant ivory became more accessible. But when alternative sources of ivory emerged, demand for Greenland's exports dwindled. Without trade, the settlers lacked iron tools, timber for ships, and the prestige goods that tied them to the wider world. Slowly, their lifeline frayed. There are darker possibilities as well. Some historians suggest famine led to violence, even to whispers of cannibalism. Others wonder if plague reached the isolated settlements, sweeping through with ruthless efficiency. Still others imagine conflicts with the Inuit, though evidence is scarce and often speculative. What we do know is that by the time European sailors returned in later centuries, the Norse were gone, and Inuit communities thrived where they had once stood. The mystery of their disappearance has fascinated explorers and scholars alike. Ruins of churches, farmsteads, and barns remain, silent witnesses to centuries of endurance and sudden decline. Animal bones tell of diets shifting from cattle and sheep towards seal and fish in the final years, a sign of desperation perhaps, or late adaptation. The soil itself reveals overgrazing and erosion, as fragile ecosystems collapsed under the weight of too many hooves. It was a society under strain, squeezed by climate, by economy, by distance, and by its own unwillingness or inability to change fast enough. Yet we must be careful not to judge too harshly. Imagine living in those settlements. You are born into a world of traditions, of faith, of pride in being Norse. You are told that cattle are wealth, that hay is survival, that Europe is the heart of your world. Year after year, the winters grow longer. But to abandon cattle for seal hunting feels like abandoning who you are. To live like Inuit might mean survival, but it might also mean losing the essence of your community. Perhaps they chose dignity over adaptation, clinging to their identity until the end. The tale of Greenland's Norse colonies is not simply one of failure. It is a story of endurance in the face of impossible odds. For nearly 5 centuries, they thrived in a place where survival itself is astonishing. Their disappearance is a mystery, yes, but also a lesson about resilience, adaptation, and the fragility of human societies when the world around them changes. And so tonight we begin this journey into their world. We will walk among their ruins, sail on their stormy seas, and sit with them in longhouses lit by smoky fire. We will see their triumphs and their struggles, and we will follow the long arc of their story from bold beginnings to silent endings. The question of why they vanished remains, But together we will explore the clues, weigh the theories, and perhaps, just perhaps, glimpse the truth hidden beneath centuries of snow and stone. Let us step further into the world of the Greenland Norse to imagine the rhythm of their days and the texture of their lives. For it is only by understanding how they lived, not just how they vanished, that we can truly grasp the meaning of their story. Close your eyes and picture the Eastern settlement around the year 1200 after Christ, when the colony was at its peak. The morning begins with the sound of livestock stirring in turf-walled barns. The houses are sturdy but humble, built of stone with sod roofs thick enough to hold warmth through the long nights. Smoke curls from the hearth inside the dim interior with the mingling scents of wood, meat, and wool. A family gathers for a simple meal, barley porridge perhaps, or bread baked from imported grain. Milk from cows and goats is precious, as is cheese, carefully stored for the winter months. Every bite reflects a fragile balance between human effort and the limits of the land. Outside, the landscape is stark yet beautiful. The fjords gleam under the weak sun, their waters teeming with seals and fish. In the distance, glaciers loom, their white cliffs glinting with cold fire. Pastures stretch across narrow valleys, but they are fragile, vulnerable to overgrazing. The Norse tend their herds carefully, cutting hay in the brief summers and stacking it for the long winters. A single miscalculation, a poor harvest, a storm, an early frost can mean hunger for the whole household. At the heart of these communities stood faith. The Norse of Greenland were Christian, deeply so, and the church played a central role in their lives. From the early 12th century, the colony even had its own bishop, residing at Garðar. Imagine the stone cathedral rising in the icy wilderness, a statement that they were part of Christendom, not forgotten exiles. Inside, lit by flickering candles, services were held in Latin, connecting these settlers to the great network of medieval Europe. The presence of the church also tied Greenland firmly into the spiritual politics of the time. Tithes were collected, bishops corresponded with Rome, and marriages were solemnized under stone arches that still stand in ruins today. And yet, beneath this order, fragility lurked. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Greenland Norse diet relied heavily on livestock, cows, sheep, and goats, even though seal and fish were plentiful. Seal bones appear in increasing numbers only in the later layers of excavation, suggesting that for centuries the settlers resisted relying on the sea as their Inuit neighbors did. They were, in essence, a European farming society transplanted onto Arctic soil. Their wealth was measured in cattle, their pride in dairy, their sense of identity rooted in plows and pastures. To live otherwise would have meant abandoning what it meant to be Norse. Trade was their lifeline. Ships came from Iceland and Norway, carrying iron, timber, grain, and luxury goods. In return, the Greenlanders sent walrus ivory, hides, and furs. For a time, this trade was lucrative. European markets prized ivory for carving, using it in religious objects, chess pieces, and ornaments. But as elephant ivory from Africa became more available, the value of Greenland's exports declined. Gradually, the ships came less often. Each absence deepened their isolation. Imagine waiting year after year for the ship that did not come, for the iron you needed to repair tools, for the salt you needed to preserve food, and watching the horizon remain empty. Socially, the colonies mirrored the hierarchy of Europe. Wealthy chieftains held larger farms, their halls hosting feasts where roasted meat and ale warmed the long nights. Poorer families struggled on smaller plots, vulnerable to famine and debt. The church collected tithes from all, and bishops in Europe sometimes complained that Greenland was late in sending its dues. Yet even on this edge of the world, the settlers carried with them the complexities of medieval life: status, obligation, faith, and pride. But life was not without joy. Summer brought long days when hay was cut, boats launched, and weddings celebrated. The sagas speak of games, of storytelling, of songs sung in the firelight. Children grew up chasing sheep on the hillsides, learning to carve, to weave, to tend animals. In those moments, Greenland was not merely survival, it was home. Still, signs of strain grew as the centuries passed. Archaeologists have studied the animal bones left behind, and the evidence is clear. In the earlier centuries, camel bones dominate, showing that beef and dairy were central. But by the later years, seal bones become more common, and fish bones appear in greater numbers. This suggests a shift, perhaps a reluctant one, toward the foods the Inuit had long relied upon. It was adaptation, but perhaps too late. The soil, too, tells its story. Layers of sediment reveal overgrazing and erosion. Fragile grasslands could not withstand centuries of cattle hooves, and once the soil was gone, the pastures could not recover. In a land where every blade of grass mattered, this was catastrophic. Deforestation also played a role. Though Greenland had few trees, the settlers cut what they could for fuel and construction, and soon even scrub and dwarf willows were scarce. Without wood, they relied heavily on imported timber, another reason why trade was so vital. The climate added its weight to the burden. Around the 14th century, the Little Ice Age began to tighten its grip. Temperatures fell, glaciers advanced, and the sea froze more often. Shorter summers meant less hay, harsher winters meant greater need, and the seas themselves grew more dangerous. The shipping lanes between Greenland and Europe, already perilous, became choked with ice. Voyages that once took weeks could be delayed or destroyed by storms. Isolation deepened, and with it, despair. What of relations with the Inuit? The Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, expanded into Greenland around the same time the Norse were settling. They were skilled hunters, perfectly adapted to the Arctic environment. They had kayaks, dog sleds, and tools designed for sea ice survival. Archaeological finds show limited contact between Norse and Inuit. Some items, such as metal tools, appear in Inuit sites, suggesting trade or scavenging. Yet the Norse seem to have borrowed little from their neighbors. There are no signs of them adopting kayaks, harpoons, or seal hunting methods. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps mistrust, or perhaps the barrier of culture and language proved insurmountable. Conflicts may have occurred. One saga hints at battles between Norse and Skraelings, a term used for indigenous peoples. Yet the archaeological record offers little evidence of sustained warfare. More likely, there was distance, perhaps occasional trade, but no deep integration. In the end, the Inuit survived where the Norse did not, a testament to the power of adaptation in such an unforgiving land. As the years wore on, the Western settlement fell first. By the mid-14th century, it was abandoned. When an Icelander visited in 1350, he found only empty houses. The Eastern settlement lingered longer, but by the early 15th century, it too was gone. The final written record, that wedding at Hvalsey in 1408, is haunting. A moment of joy preserved in ink, followed by silence. What became of the bride and groom? Did they watch their community dwindle year by year, until even the churches stood empty and the cattle pens were silent? Did they leave, sailing into the unknown in desperate hope? Or did they remain until death claimed the last of them? The answers are lost. Yet the ruins endure. The stone walls of Hvalsey Church still stand, stark against the Greenland sky. Turf mounds mark the outlines of farmsteads. Bones lie buried in cold earth, whispering of diets, diseases, and struggles. Every fragment adds to the story, but none complete it. The mystery remains, a silence as vast as the ice itself. And so, the tale of the Greenland Norse is one of resilience and fragility entwined. For centuries, they endured where few could, clinging to identity, to faith, and to connection with a distant world. But in the end, the forces of climate, economy, and isolation proved stronger. Their disappearance is not just a question of history. It is a reminder of how tightly human survival is bound to adaptation, and how costly it can be when adaptation comes too slowly. As we move deeper into the mystery of the vanished Greenland Norse, the question looms larger. Why exactly did they disappear? Historians, scientists, and storytellers have wrestled with this question for centuries. No single answer suffices. Instead, the truth seems to lie in a tapestry of causes, each thread weakening the fabric of the colony until it unraveled completely. Let us trace these threads, one by one, through the evidence and the silence they left behind. The first, and perhaps most compelling, is climate change. During the early centuries of settlement, Greenland enjoyed a relatively mild period, sometimes called the medieval warm period. Summers were long enough for haymaking, winters less brutal than they would later become. But by the 1300s, the Little Ice Age began to grip the North Atlantic. Glaciers crept forward, sea ice thickened, and temperatures fell. What had once been marginal farmland became perilous. Crops failed more often, and the pastures could not sustain cattle through longer winters. For a farming society built upon the wealth of livestock, this shift was devastating. Evidence from isotopic analysis of bones tells the story. Early Greenland Norse skeletons show diets heavy in dairy and beef. Later skeletons, from the 14th and 15th centuries, reveal increasing reliance on seals and marine food. This was a late adaptation, a survival strategy forced upon them by failing pastures. Yet it may have come too late. The society that had defined itself by cattle and hay was, in the end, reduced to hunting the animals they had once regarded as lesser fare. The shift was real, but the cultural cost was immense. The second thread is trade collapse. Greenland was never self-sufficient. Iron for tools and weapons, timber for construction and shipbuilding, grain for bread, all these had to be imported from Europe. In return, Greenland exported walrus ivory, hides, and furs. For centuries, this exchange bound the colonies to the wider world. But as the 13th century advanced, new trade routes opened. Elephant ivory from Africa became more accessible and more desirable. Walrus tusks, once prized, fell from fashion. As demand dwindled, ships came less frequently. By the 14th century, voyages that once arrived every few years became rare, sporadic, and finally ceased altogether. Imagine the anxiety of watching the sea each summer, waiting for sails on the horizon, knowing that without iron you could not mend your plows, without timber you could not build new ships, without grain you could not feed your family. Each absence tightened the noose of isolation. Letters from Europe complained that Greenland was failing to send its tithes to the church. Some even suggested that the colony had fallen into neglect of faith. In truth, they were simply being cut off, abandoned by a world that no longer needed what they offered. Then there is the matter of conflict. The Norse sagas speak of skraelings, a word used for indigenous peoples both in Greenland and in North America. Some accounts describe skirmishes, violent clashes between Norse and Inuit hunters.
Archaeological evidence is thin, but possible hints remain. Arrowheads in Norse settlements, traces of weapons that may not have been European. Yet it is hard to know whether these represent true battles or isolated encounters. The lack of widespread destruction in the ruins suggests that conflict was not the primary cause of collapse.
Still, in a society already weakened by hunger and isolation, even sporadic violence could have been the final blow for some communities. Disease is another possibility. The 14th century was the age of the Black Death in Europe, a plague that decimated populations across the continent. Could it have reached Greenland? The answer is uncertain. The colony was so isolated that plague may never have crossed the seas. Yet, if even one infected ship made landfall, the consequences would have been catastrophic. With such a small population, a plague could have swept through like fire, leaving only silence behind. Archaeological remains show no clear signs of plague, but the possibility cannot be dismissed. Famine, however, is more visible. Bones of livestock show signs of malnutrition in the later years. Soil analysis reveals overgrazing and erosion. The pastures were pushed beyond their limits, and once the land failed, recovery was impossible. Human remains tell the same story. Later skeletons show signs of nutritional stress, brittle bones, and even lesions associated with starvation. It seems likely that many simply died of hunger, slowly, over years of dwindling resources. Yet famine alone does not explain the complete disappearance. Even in the harshest famines of Europe, some survived, some endured. So why not here? Part of the answer may lie in social and cultural rigidity. The Norse settlers identified themselves as European farmers. Their wealth, their pride, their social order all depended on livestock and land. Even as conditions worsened, they clung to these values. Seal hunting was not considered honorable. Fishing was not their way. To live like the Inuit would have meant abandoning their identity, their very sense of who they were. And so they resisted adaptation, holding to tradition until the end. This refusal to change is perhaps the most haunting aspect of their story. The Inuit, facing the same climate, thrived. They had dog sleds for winter travel, kayaks for hunting, harpoons for seals, and a diet perfectly suited to the Arctic. They adapted with skill and resilience, shaping their lives around the environment rather than resisting it. The Norse, by contrast, sought to force the environment into their European mold. They raised cattle where grass barely grew, built churches of stone in a land where wood was scarce, and dreamed of Europe even as Europe forgot them. Still, some suggest a more dramatic end. One theory imagines a final desperate voyage. Perhaps, as famine deepened, a group of settlers decided to leave. They may have sailed for Iceland, for Norway, or even westward, seeking Vinland once more. If so, their fate is unknown. No records survive of their arrival anywhere. They may have perished at sea, swallowed by the Atlantic, their story ending in the waves. Others wonder if assimilation occurred. Could some Norse have joined Inuit communities, abandoning their farms and blending into the hunter's life? If so, the traces are faint. No clear genetic or cultural evidence links modern Inuit directly to Norse settlers, though some oral traditions speak of pale-skinned people encountered long ago. It is possible that a few survived in this way, but if so, they left no lasting mark. There is even the suggestion of darker possibilities. Archaeologists at Herjolfsnes found graves with signs of malnutrition, but also unusual wear on bones, as though the dead had lived through extreme hardship. Some whisper of cannibalism in the final years, though evidence is speculative at best.
In times of famine, such things are not impossible, but no proof has been found.
Still, the silence of the records leaves room for grim imagination. One by one, the threads tighten. Climate, famine, trade collapse, cultural rigidity, possible disease, and isolation. Together, they form a net too strong to escape. By the 1400s, the Greenland Norse were gone. The last wedding at Hvalsey in 1408 stands as a haunting echo, the final recorded moment of joy. After that, the silence is total. When later explorers came to Greenland, they found only ruins. The Inuit lived on, thriving where the Norse had perished. The stone churches, the turf houses, the abandoned farms, these became monuments to endurance and loss. To this day, standing among those ruins, one feels the weight of the silence. The wind whistles through stone walls, the sea crashes against the fjords, and one cannot help but wonder, what were the final days like? Did they watch their neighbors leave or die one by one until only a handful remained? Did they cling to their faith, praying in empty churches, hoping for a ship that never came? Or did they, in the end, simply fade quietly into the snow? The mystery endures because it is not fully solvable. Archaeology gives us fragments, science gives us clues, but the human heart of the story is lost. Perhaps that is why the tale fascinates us so deeply. It is not only about Vikings and ice. It is about resilience and fragility, about the choices societies make when the world changes. It is about what happens when pride, tradition, and identity collide with survival. And it is, ultimately, about us. For even now, as the climate shifts once more, we find ourselves asking the same question. Will we adapt in time, or will we too cling to traditions until the world moves on without us? The silence left by the vanished Greenland Norse is profound, yet the earth itself has begun to whisper their story back to us. Archaeology, careful and patient, has unearthed fragments of lives once lived in the cold fjords. Stones, bones, and soil, these are the voices of the past. By listening to them, we can step into the longhouses, walk among the churches, and perhaps catch glimpses of the final winters that sealed their fate. One of the most remarkable sites is Hvalsey, where the last written record of the Norse, that wedding of 1408, was held. The church still stands today, its stone walls weathered but proud. Step inside, and you can imagine the flicker of candles, the echo of Latin prayers, the moment when a bride and groom vowed their lives to one another, unaware that they were part of the colony's final generation. Around the church lie graves, their stones covered in moss. Some have been excavated, their skeletons examined. From these bones, we learn that the Norse endured hardships we can scarcely imagine: arthritis from hard labor, malnutrition etched into fragile frames, signs of cold and hunger endured year after year. Elsewhere, at Gardar, the seat of the bishop, excavations have revealed the outline of a cathedral, farmsteads, and barns large enough to house hundreds of cattle. This was once the heart of the colony, a place of authority and faith. Yet the grandeur was fragile. The very barns that symbolized wealth also demanded enormous amounts of hay and labor. When the climate cooled and pastures failed, these barns became monuments to an unsustainable dream. At Herjolfsnes, another major site, archaeologists have uncovered one of the most haunting collections of evidence: graves containing remarkably preserved garments. The cold soil preserved woolen tunics, cloaks, and hoods dating from the 14th and 15th centuries. These garments tell us much about daily life and culture. They were fashioned in European styles, some elegant, some simple, reflecting the social divisions within the colony. They reveal that even in their final years, the Greenland Norse clung to European fashions, maintaining ties of identity with a distant world. Yet they also show signs of wear and patching, the marks of scarcity and decline. A cloak worn thin, mended again and again, speaks volumes about a society struggling to sustain itself. The bones of animals, too, speak. Excavations at both the eastern and western settlements have revealed shifting patterns in diet. In the early centuries, cattle and sheep bones dominate. Later, seal bones increase dramatically. By the final decades, seal made up as much as 80% of the diet. This suggests a reluctant but undeniable adaptation. The settlers, once proud cattle farmers, had turned to the sea. Yet the change was late, perhaps too late. Fishing remains surprisingly scarce in the archaeological record, raising the question of why the Norse did not embrace it fully. Perhaps it was stigma, perhaps lack of equipment, or perhaps cultural rigidity once more kept them from what might have saved them. Soil analysis tells another story. Layers of sediment reveal erosion caused by overgrazing. The settlers had pushed their fragile pastures too far. Once the thin Arctic soil was gone, nothing could replace it. The collapse of the land mirrored the collapse of society. What of their health? Human skeletons reveal much. Many show signs of nutritional stress. Enamel defects on teeth indicating childhood hunger. Brittle bones from poor diets. Arthritis from heavy labor. Some bear the marks of infections, untreated in a world without advanced medicine. Life was short, harsh, and filled with physical pain. Yet these bones also reveal resilience. Many lived into their 50s and 60s, remarkable for the Middle Ages, testifying to strength and endurance. Modern techniques, such as isotope analysis, have illuminated even more. By studying the chemical signatures in bones, scientists can trace diets across lifetimes. The results confirm the shift from land-based to sea-based foods. They also suggest that even in the final years, some individuals resisted this shift more than others, clinging to livestock products even as hunger deepened. In these chemical traces, we see not only survival strategies, but also cultural choices. To eat seal was survival, to drink milk was identity. Artifacts also reveal glimpses of trade and contact. Fragments of imported timber, iron nails, and even luxury goods such as bronze ornaments have been found. These prove that for centuries ships did come, bringing goods and news from Europe. Yet the scarcity of such finds in later centuries underscores the growing isolation. When the ships stopped, the flow of iron, wood, and cloth stopped as well. The Greenland Norse were left with what they had, their tools growing dull, their buildings decaying without repair. And then there is the mystery of the graves. At Herjolfsnes, bodies were buried in fine European clothing, even as hunger gnawed at the community. This suggests that dignity and tradition remain central, even in decline. To be buried in proper garments, to be laid to rest as a Christian, mattered deeply. It speaks of a people who held to faith and identity to the very end. Some graves also show unusual patterns. Hurried burials, bodies interred in shallow soil, perhaps reflecting desperation in the final years. Archaeology also gives us hints of contact with the Inuit. Some Norse sites contain artifacts that appear to be of Inuit origin, fragments of harpoons, for instance, while Inuit sites contain pieces of metal that must have come from Norse hands. These exchanges, whether through trade or scavenging, show that the two worlds touched, even if only at the edges. Yet the absence of deeper integration remains striking.
The Norse could see that the Inuit thrived where they struggled. They could see kayaks darting across icy waters, dogs pulling sleds across frozen ground. And still, they did not adopt these tools. It is perhaps the most poignant silence of all, the silence of ideas that could have saved them, left unused. In recent years, climate scientists and archaeologists working together have reconstructed past weather patterns. Ice cores from Greenland reveal the cooling temperatures of the Little Ice Age. They show how summers shortened and storms increased, making voyages treacherous. They confirm what the bones and soil suggest, that the environment itself turned against the settlers. And yet, as haunting as these discoveries are, they do not give us certainty. They give us fragments, clues, echoes. We can trace diets, measure erosion, map settlements, and still the final chapter remains unwritten. Did they die quietly, one by one, until only graves remained? Did a final group sail away into the unknown, seeking salvation across the sea? Did some join Inuit bands, their identities dissolving into new lives? Archaeology cannot answer these questions. It can only remind us of the silence that follows. But perhaps that silence is the very heart of the mystery. The Greenland Norse did not write their ending. They left no chronicle, no saga of the final years. They vanished into history's shadows, leaving us to wonder. And in that wondering, their story remains alive.
Each excavation, each discovery, is another attempt to bridge the centuries, to hear their voices once more. The ruins themselves are powerful storytellers. Walk among them, and you feel the weight of centuries. The walls of Halsey Church, the turf outlines of farmhouses, the stones of animal pens, all stand as monuments to endurance and fragility. The wind whispers through them, carrying questions we may never answer. And yet, in those questions, we find meaning. For their story is not only about the past. It is about resilience, identity, and the cost of refusing or failing to adapt. As archaeologists continue their work, new technologies may yet reveal more. DNA analysis, isotopes, satellite mapping, all hold promise for uncovering the details of lives long lost. But even as science advances, the heart of the story remains deeply human. It is the story of families who risked everything to build homes on the edge of the world, who endured for centuries, and who finally disappeared, leaving only stones and silence behind. If Greenland was the fragile edge of Europe's medieval frontier, then Vinland was the dream beyond the edge, a land whispered of in sagas, rich in timber and grapes, where opportunity seemed boundless. The story of Vinland, whether myth or memory, is forever tied to the fate of Greenland. For the same people who clung to life among the fjords of Greenland also cast their eyes farther west, toward a land that promised abundance but gave only fleeting hope. To understand Greenland fully, we must sail with them into the wider Atlantic and see how their westward ventures unfolded. The tale begins with Erik the Red's son, Leif Erikson, around the year 1000 after Christ. According to the sagas, particularly the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red, Leif heard from Bjarni Herjolfsson, a trader blown off course, of a land far to the west. Curious, Leif sailed and found a place he named Vinland. The sagas describe wild grapes growing freely, salmon teeming in rivers, and forests filled with tall trees, treasures Greenland lacked. Archaeology lends weight to these tales. In Newfoundland, at a site called Lonzo Meadows, ruins of Norse buildings have been uncovered. Longhouses built in the Norse style, iron nails forged in Norse ways, and artifacts unmistakably Scandinavian confirm that the Norse reached North America centuries before Columbus. The settlement appears to have been small, likely a seasonal outpost, perhaps housing 80 to 100 people. Here, the Greenland Norse harvested timber, hunted, and possibly explored further south. But the site was short-lived, abandoned within a few years or decades. Why did Vinland fail where Greenland endured for centuries? The sagas hint at conflict with indigenous peoples. The Norse called them skraelings. Encounters began with trade, but soon turned violent. In one saga, a bull frightened the locals, leading to clashes that left Norse dead. Outnumbered and far from reinforcements, the Norse abandoned their attempt. The sagas portray the skraelings as fierce and numerous, their arrows deadly, their resistance insurmountable. Unlike in Greenland, where isolation spared them from large-scale conflict, in Vinland the Norse found themselves on contested ground. The logistical challenges were immense as well. Vinland was far from Iceland and Norway, even farther from Europe than Greenland. Ships already strained to make the journey to Greenland across icy seas. To push on to Vinland required greater risks and resources. Without a steady stream of supplies, without strong trade ties, a colony could not last. Greenland, at least, had ivory to offer Europe. Vinland offered timber, but timber was plentiful in Scandinavia itself. There was no economic incentive strong enough to sustain the venture. And so, Vinland remained a ghost of possibility. For Greenlanders, it was remembered in sagas, perhaps as a dream, perhaps as a warning. Archaeological evidence suggests that Greenlanders continued to make occasional voyages westward, perhaps to gather timber or iron from bogs. Some Norse artifacts have been found deep in North America, though whether they arrived through direct Norse travel or through indigenous trade networks remains debated. What is certain is that Vinland never became a permanent colony. It was a frontier too far, a bridge too fragile between worlds. The contrast with Greenland is telling. In Greenland, the Norse endured for nearly 5 centuries. They built churches, raised families, and maintained ties to Europe. In Vinland, they could not even last a generation. Why the difference? Part of the answer lies in environment. Greenland, harsh though it was, had fjords where cattle could graze and hay could grow. It was not abundant, but it was sufficient. Vinland may have been rich, but it was contested, and the Norse lacked the numbers to secure it. Another difference lies in identity. In Greenland, settlers saw themselves as farmers, as Europeans transplanted into the Arctic. Their pride was tied to cattle, their faith to churches, their social order to the structures they had brought with them. In Vinland, there was no time to transplant identity. The attempt was brief, improvised, and met with resistance. Without the weight of tradition and community behind it, Vinland could not root itself. And yet, the very existence of Vinland in the sagas tells us something important. It tells us that the Norse were explorers of astonishing courage. They crossed oceans in ships of wood and iron, guided by stars, winds, and memory. They pushed farther west than any Europeans would again for centuries. Though Vinland failed, it was not for lack of daring. It failed because the world they found was not waiting to be settled, but already full of peoples who would not yield their lands. Some historians argue that the dream of Vinland distracted Greenland, that resources spent on westward voyages might have been better used to secure survival at home. Others see Vinland as proof of Greenland's strength in its early centuries, when population and resources allowed for expansion. Either way, the shadow of Vinland loomed over Greenland's fate. It was a reminder that the frontier could be both opportunity and peril.
There is also a deeper connection between the two. Vinland's failure highlighted the importance of trade. Greenland endured because of walrus ivory, thin as that lifeline was. Vinland offered no such commodity. Without something to bind it to Europe, it withered. When Greenland's ivory trade collapsed centuries later, its fate mirrored Vinland's. Both became isolated, cut off, abandoned by the networks that had once sustained them. Standing today at Lonso Meadows, amidst the reconstructed longhouses and the wind-swept Newfoundland landscape, one feels the same haunting silence as in Greenland. The ruins speak of courage and failure, of dreams begun and ended. They remind us that history is full of ventures that did not endure, not because of lack of will, but because the world is unforgiving. For the Greenland Norse, Vinland must have been a tantalizing memory. Perhaps stories of its abundance lingered as winters grew harsher at home.
Perhaps parents told children of the land where grapes grew and forests stretched wide, even as they huddled in smoke-filled houses with seal meat their only food. Vinland was both a promise and a reminder of what they could not have. The comparison between Greenland and Vinland sharpens the lesson of adaptation. In both cases, the Norse brought with them the tools, values, and practices of Europe. In Greenland, those practices worked for centuries, but only just. In Vinland, they failed almost immediately. In neither case did the Norse fully adopt the practices of the indigenous peoples who thrived in those lands. The Inuit in Greenland, the First Nations in Vinland. They had knowledge and skills that could have sustained Norse settlers. But the cultural gap remained too wide. Identity, pride, and tradition stood as barriers, and so the Norse remained outsiders in lands they hoped to make their own. In this sense, Vinland is not just a footnote to Greenland's story. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when expansion meets resistance, when identity collides with survival, when daring is not enough to overcome the realities of place and people. It is the story of ambition met by limits, of explorers who reached the edge of possibility and could go no farther. And so, as we reflect on Greenland's centuries and Vinland's fleeting years, we see the arc of a people pushing outward, testing the world, daring the seas, and in the end, discovering that even the boldest explorers must bow to the realities of climate, geography, and human resilience. Vinland's ruins whisper of lost opportunities. Greenland's ruins whisper of endurance stretched too far. Together, they form one story, the westernmost reach of medieval Europe, a frontier that shone briefly, then faded into silence. When we step back from the ruins of Greenland and the fleeting traces of Vinland, the question that lingers is not only what happened to them, but what does their story mean for us? History is not just a record of past lives, it is a mirror held up to the present. The disappearance of the Greenland Norse is more than a mystery. It is a parable of survival, adaptation, and the cost of failing to change when the world demands it. For nearly 500 years, the Greenland Norse endured on the edge of the habitable world. That alone is extraordinary. They were not simply raiders or wanderers, as the stereotype of Vikings often suggests. They were farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and Christians who built a society where no society had been before. They raised families, built churches, buried their dead, and maintained ties to a world across the sea. Their survival was a triumph of determination, and yet, after centuries of endurance, they vanished. That vanishing is the heart of their story, and it is what makes it so powerful. The lessons begin with the environment. The Little Ice Age was not an apocalypse, but it was enough to tip the balance. In Europe, colder winters were difficult but survivable. Crops shifted, trade routes adapted, societies bent but did not break. In Greenland, where survival was already fragile, the shift was catastrophic. A few degrees colder meant less hay, more sea ice, fewer ships. The environment did not destroy them overnight. It eroded their foundation year after year until it gave way. This is the first lesson. Survival on the margins leaves no room for error. The Greenland Norse lived so close to the edge that when conditions changed, they had little buffer. Their story reminds us that resilience is not infinite. Even the strongest societies can falter if their environment shifts faster than they can adapt. The second lesson lies in culture and identity. The Norse saw themselves as Europeans, as farmers and cattle raisers. These were not just economic practices, they were the foundation of who they were. Cattle were wealth, hay was status, and churches were symbols of belonging to Christendom. To abandon cattle for seal hunting, to live like the Inuit, would have felt like abandoning themselves. And so, even as conditions worsened, they clung to tradition. Archaeology shows that they did adapt to some extent, eating more seals, using what resources they could, but their adaptation was slow, reluctant, and incomplete. This is the second lesson. Culture can be both a strength and a weakness. It binds people together, gives meaning to life, and preserves identity across generations. But it can also blind societies to new realities. The Greenland Norse clung to the ways of Europe even as Europe turned away from them. Their identity was their pride, but it was also their undoing. The third lesson is about connection. Greenland survived as long as it did because of trade. Walrus ivory, hides, and furs tied them into the networks of medieval Europe. For centuries, this connection sustained them, providing iron, timber, and grain they could not produce themselves. But when those connections frayed, when Europe no longer valued what Greenland offered, the colony was left isolated. Ships came less often, then not at all. Without trade, without connection, Greenland collapsed. This is the third lesson. No society is an island, even on an island of ice. Survival depends not only on local resilience, but on ties to the wider world. When those ties weaken, the consequences can be fatal. There is also a lesson in humility. For centuries, the Norse saw themselves as masters of the seas, conquerors of lands, bearers of culture. They built stone churches to assert their place in Christendom, even as their farms crumbled. Yet, in the end, it was the Inuit, peoples often dismissed in Norse accounts as Skraelings, who endured. The Inuit adapted perfectly to the Arctic, their technologies and traditions tuned to the environment. Kayaks, dog sleds, seal hunting tools, all gave them resilience the Norse lacked. Where the Norse vanished, the Inuit thrived. This is the fourth lesson. Arrogance in identity can blind us to wisdom. The Norse could have learned from the Inuit, but pride and cultural boundaries kept them apart. In that refusal lies part of the tragedy. For modern readers, these lessons are hauntingly familiar. Today, the world faces its own climate shifts, its own pressures of adaptation. Like the Norse, we live within cultures that value certain ways of life, certain identities, certain comforts. Like the Norse, we depend on fragile connections, global trade networks, resources drawn from far-off places, systems that seem stable until they suddenly are not. And like the Norse, we may find that survival depends not only on strength, but on the willingness to adapt, to change, to learn from those who know how to live in the environments we face. The story of Greenland is often framed as one of failure, but we should not forget that it is also a story of extraordinary resilience.
For centuries, they built a life where no life seemed possible. They did not fail immediately. They endured for generations, raising children and grandchildren in a land of ice. Their disappearance is tragic, but it is not simple weakness. It is a reminder that even the strongest societies are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. There is, too, a spiritual lesson. The Norse of Greenland were Christians, deeply so. Their churches were not just places of worship, they were symbols of belonging to a wider world. When archaeologists uncover burials in fine garments, even in the colony's final years, they reveal a people who held to dignity and faith until the end. To die in proper clothing, to be buried as a Christian, mattered profoundly. This tells us that even in decline, they sought meaning, identity, and hope. It is a reminder that survival is not only about food and shelter, but about meaning and belief. Perhaps this is the final lesson. The measure of a society is not only whether it survives, but how it faces its end. The Greenland Norse may have vanished, but they did so with dignity. They left behind churches of stone, garments of care, and graves that speak of faith. They did not vanish into chaos, they faded into silence, carrying their identity with them. And yet their silence still speaks. When we walk among their ruins, we feel the echo of their struggle, the weight of their choices. Their story forces us to ask, how do we respond when our environment changes? Do we cling to tradition, or do we adapt? Do we ignore wisdom from others, or do we learn? Do we assume our connections will endure, or do we prepare for isolation? These are not just questions for the past, they are questions for the present. The Greenland Norse are gone, but their story endures because it is our story too. We live in a world of fragile climates, fragile trade, fragile identities.
Their fate is a warning, but also a call to resilience. If we listen carefully, we can hear their voices in the wind across the fjords, whispering not only of loss, but of the courage to endure, and the cost of failing to change. In the end, perhaps the most profound meaning of their disappearance is this. It reminds us that no society is eternal. All are subject to the forces of nature, to the demands of adaptation, to the fragility of connection. The Norse in Greenland dreamed of permanence, but the ice had other plans. Their story teaches us that permanence is an illusion. Survival belongs to those who adapt, not to those who cling. And so, as we leave the ruins of Greenland, we carry with us not only the mystery of their disappearance, but the lessons of their lives. They are not forgotten. Their silence speaks still, if we have ears to hear. Close your eyes, and let us step into the skin of someone who lived through the final days of the Greenland Norse. History gives us bones, ruins, and sagas. But imagination allows us to breathe life into those fragments. So tonight, let us walk with one of them, an imagined voice drawn from the evidence, a composite of the many who once stood in the cold winds of Greenland and wondered if the world had forgotten them. The year is around 1450 after Christ. The eastern settlement, once vibrant with farms and feasts, is now scattered, fragile, and weary. You are a farmer's son, now gray-haired, your body bent from years of toil. You remember when you were a boy, the valley filled with cattle lowing, children laughing, and the church bells calling the faithful to prayer. Now the bells are silent, the cattle few, and the children fewer still. The winter has grown long, longer than you remember from your youth. Snow covers the pastures where grass once grew thick enough to fill the barns.
You remember summers when the hay was tall, when men cut it with scythes and women bundled it in the sun. Now summer feels like a brief pause between storms. The hay grows thin, the barns half empty, and you wonder if the cattle will survive the season. Your father told you stories of ships. He said that when he was young, ships came every few years from Iceland or Norway. They brought iron, timber, grain, and news from the wider world. They carried priests and merchants, travelers with tales of kings and wars in distant lands. You remember one ship when you were a boy. You remember the thrill of seeing sails on the horizon, the rush to the shore, the joy of receiving iron nails and a bit of fine cloth. But now it has been decades since a ship has come. You watch the sea each summer, scanning for sails, but the horizon is always empty. Sometimes you dream of ships, only to wake and feel the bitter truth. You are forgotten. Your house is built of stone and turf. Inside, the air is thick with smoke from the hearth. The beams are darkened with soot, the roof patched with sod. Your wife tends the fire, stirring a pot of seal meat. Once she would have made butter and cheese from your cows, but the herd has dwindled. Now the sea provides, whether you like it or not.
The seal meat tastes heavy, and sometimes you dream of fresh bread, of cheese soft on the tongue, of milk warm from the cow. But dreams do not fill your belly. Your children are grown, but they have not stayed. Some sailed away years ago, seeking Iceland, perhaps Norway. You do not know if they survived. Others died here, their graves marked by stones near the church. You visit them sometimes, brushing snow from the stones, whispering prayers in the silence. The church itself still stands, but it is empty more often than not. The priest died years ago, and no new one ever came. You still pray, kneeling in the cold nave, your voice echoing against stone walls. You pray for salvation, for ships, for warmth. You pray, but the silence answers. The Inuit come sometimes. You see them on the fjord, their kayaks swift and silent. They are hunters of seals and fish, thriving where you struggle. You watch them with a mix of awe and bitterness. They wear furs so warm that the cold seems not to touch them. Their sleds glide across the snow. You wonder if they laugh at you, the stubborn Norse farmer clinging to cattle and churches. Sometimes they trade, fish for iron, sealskins for cloth. Once, one gave you a harpoon tip of bone, carved smooth and strong. You have used it, though you do not like to admit it. Their ways work, but to live as they live feels like surrender. You are Norse, and you will not forget it. Still, you cannot help but envy them. They thrive in the cold that kills your cattle. Their children grow strong, while yours wither. You wonder if your pride is foolish, if stubbornness is the true cause of your hunger. But it is too late to change. You are old, your bones stiff, your faith set. You will die Norse, even if it means dying hungry. The past haunts you. You remember feasts in the great hall when roasted meat filled the air and ale flowed freely. You remember weddings with laughter and dancing when the whole valley gathered to celebrate. You remember the church filled with voices, chanting Latin prayers that echoed to heaven. Now the hall is silent, the ale long gone, the church empty. The world you knew has slipped away, one season at a time, until only shadows remain. Sometimes at night you dream of Vinland. Your grandfather told you stories of it. A land of grapes and forests where food was plentiful and the soil rich. He said your people once sailed there, that they built houses and harvested timber. He said they left because the Skraelings were too many, too fierce. But sometimes you wonder if leaving was the mistake. Perhaps if your people had stayed, you would not be dying here in the cold. Perhaps Vinland was salvation, lost to fear. You will never know. Your body weakens. Each winter feels harder than the last. Your hands are rough, your joints ache, and the cold seeps into your bones no matter how close you sit to the fire. Food is scarce, and you eat less so the children may eat more. You do not complain. This is life now. One day you walk to the church. The snow is deep, the wind sharp, but you go anyway. Inside, the air is colder than outside, the stone walls unyielding. You kneel before the altar, though there is no priest, no candles, no bread, no wine. You whisper the prayers you still remember, words passed down through years of silence. You pray not for ships, not for food, but for remembrance. You do not want your people to be forgotten. You want someone, someday, to know that you lived, that you tried, that you endured as long as you could. You rise slowly, your knees stiff, and look around the church. The walls are cracked, the roof sagging, but the stones stand firm. You wonder if they will outlast you, if they will outlast all of your people. Perhaps they will stand for centuries, until strangers come and wonder who built them. You hope they will understand. You hope they will hear your prayers in the silence. That night, you sit by the hearth with your wife. The fire burns low, the pot nearly empty. You hold her hand, rough and thin, and you both know what the other is thinking. This is the end, not just of you, but of your people. There will be no ships, no rescue, no return to Europe. There will be only snow, stone, and silence. But still you sit together, still you endure, still you remember who you are. In the morning, the wind rises, sweeping snow across the fjord. You step outside, look across the frozen land, and feel both sorrow and pride. Your people are ending, but you have endured for centuries in a place few could. You were farmers on ice, Christians in the Arctic, Norse in a land that never truly welcomed you. You did not conquer the land, but you lived here. That is worth remembering. And so, as the final winters close in, you take comfort in one thought: the stones will remain. The churches, the houses, the graves, they will stand long after you are gone. Perhaps strangers will find them. Perhaps they will ask, who lived here? What became of them? And in their asking, you will be remembered. The story of the Greenland Norse does not end in triumph. It ends in silence, in fading fires and empty halls. But it is not a story of failure alone. It is a story of endurance, of identity, of people who clung to who they were until the very end. Through your eyes, through the eyes of one who lived and died in that silence, we see not just the collapse of a colony, but the persistence of humanity in the face of impossible odds. And as we leave you standing in the snow, watching the empty horizon, we carry your voice with us. You are gone, but not forgotten. Your story lives on, in stone, in soil, in sagas, and in the whispers of the wind across the Greenland fjords. The ruins of Greenland's vanished Norse colonies stand silent against the Arctic wind. Yet their story has never truly been silent. Across centuries, the mystery of their disappearance has haunted scholars, inspired storytellers, and echoed as a warning in the halls of modern science. The Greenland Norse may have vanished, but their absence continues to shape how we think about exploration, adaptation, and resilience. Let us begin with history itself. For medieval Europe, Greenland was a curiosity, a distant outpost at the edge of the known world. When the colonies disappeared, their memory faded. By the time of the Renaissance, Greenland had become a legend more than a place. Its churches and farms forgotten, its people remembered only in fragments of old sagas. When European sailors returned centuries later, they found Inuit thriving where Norse ruins lay. The mystery of what happened to the Norse sparked curiosity, but for a long time it remained just that, a mystery whispered by explorers, sailors, and scholars. In the 18th and 19th centuries, antiquarians began to study the ruins seriously. Hvalsey Church, with its weathered stone walls still standing tall, became an icon of the vanished colony. Travelers described walking among roofless houses, turf mounds, and crumbling barns, feeling the eerie presence of a lost people. Romantic writers wove the ruins into tales of tragedy, seeing in them a parable of human fragility. The mystery of the Norse captured the imagination of an age fascinated by ruins and lost civilizations. By the 20th century, archaeology took up the challenge. Excavations at Herjolfsnes, Godar, and other sites began to reveal the material reality of Norse life in Greenland. Bones, tools, clothing, and soil layers replaced legend with evidence. Scientific methods, radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, pollen studies brought precision to the story. Each discovery added depth, showing not only how the Norse lived, but how they declined. The image of proud farmers slowly forced to eat seals, of cattle giving way to malnutrition, of churches standing empty became clearer. And yet the mystery did not vanish. Archaeology explained much, but the human heart of the story, the choices, the emotions, the final moments remained elusive. The Greenland Norse also became symbols in modern debates about survival. In the late 20th century, as concerns about climate change grew, scholars began to see Greenland as a case study. Here was a society that failed to adapt to environmental change. Here was a warning of what happens when cultural rigidity prevents necessary adaptation. The phrase, the Greenland Norse syndrome, entered discussions of sustainability. The danger of clinging to tradition even as conditions shift around us. Jarrett Diamond's book, Collapse, popularized this view, presenting the Norse as an example of a society undone by environmental change and stubborn refusal to adapt. Diamond argued that the Norse could have survived by learning from the Inuit, but pride and identity prevented them. This interpretation has been debated, with some scholars cautioning that the Norse did adapt more than Diamond suggested. Still, the idea has power. Greenland has become a mirror in which we see our own anxieties about climate, adaptation, and resilience. In popular culture, the vanished Norse also live on. Novels imagine their last days, filling the silence with stories of famine, faith, and fading hope. Films and documentaries portray their settlements, sometimes romanticized, sometimes starkly realistic. Video games even place players in the ruins of Greenland, letting them wander among churches and fjords haunted by absence. Each retelling keeps the story alive, even as it changes with the needs of each generation. The fascination lies partly in the mystery itself. We do not know exactly how they vanished, and that uncertainty invites imagination.
Were they wiped out by famine? Did they sail away into the unknown? Did some join the Inuit, their identity dissolving into another culture? The lack of answers makes the story endlessly compelling. It allows us to project our own fears and hopes onto them, to see in their silence whatever lesson we most need. The story also resonates because it is human. It is not about kings or empires, but about farmers and families, about ordinary people living in extraordinary circumstances. We see ourselves in them, their pride, their faith, their stubbornness, their longing for connection.
Their story reminds us that history is not just grand events, but the quiet struggles of daily life. When we walk among their ruins, we feel not only curiosity, but empathy. The cultural impact of the Greenland Norse also ties into the wider fascination with Vikings. For centuries, Vikings were remembered in Europe as raiders, brutal and pagan. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, the image shifted. Vikings became symbols of exploration, adventure, and resilience. Greenland fit into this new narrative. It was not about raiding, but about settlement, about daring to build lives on the edge of the world. In this sense, the Greenland Norse became part of a broader reimagining of Viking identity, less savage, more heroic, more human. In modern Greenland, the ruins of Norse settlements are part of cultural heritage. They stand alongside Inuit traditions as reminders that the island's history is layered, complex, and shared. For Greenlanders today, the Norse are not ancestors, but part of the tapestry of the land. Their ruins are preserved, studied, and visited, testaments to both endurance and fragility. There is also a literary and symbolic legacy. Writers have long used the Greenland Norse as metaphors for isolation, for the struggle against nature, for the fragility of civilization. Poets describe the silent churches as monuments to lost faith. Novelists imagine the final winters as tragedies of stubborn pride. Historians use them as cautionary tales about environmental limits. Their story is endlessly adaptable because it speaks to universal themes: survival, identity, adaptation, and loss. But perhaps the deepest cultural impact is the way their story connects past to present. As we face rising seas, shifting climates, and fragile global connections, we see ourselves in them. We too live in societies bound by tradition, dependent on trade, vulnerable to environmental change. Their fate reminds us that resilience requires adaptation, that survival is not guaranteed, that pride can be fatal. It is a warning, but also an inspiration. For if they endured for centuries in Greenland, perhaps we too can endure, if we learn the lessons they did not. And so, the story of the Greenland Norse is not only about a vanished colony. It is about how we remember, how we interpret, how we use the past to understand the present. Their ruins are not just stones, they are mirrors. Their silence is not just absence, it is a voice speaking across centuries. They vanished, but in vanishing they became eternal, a story retold again and again, each time with new meaning. As our long journey through the frozen fjords of Greenland draws to a close, let us pause and gather the threads of this story. We began with a question: what really happened to the Viking colonies in Greenland, and why did they vanish after centuries of survival? We have traced the arc of their tale, from bold beginnings under Erik the Red to silent endings among abandoned churches and empty barns. We have walked with archaeologists through ruins, sifted through bones and soil, and listened to sagas that blur legend and truth. We have imagined the voices of those who lived through the final winters. And now, at the end, we ask again,
What do we see when we look into the silence they left behind? We see first courage. The Greenland Norse were not reckless wanderers, but families, farmers, and craftsmen who dared to settle on the edge of the world. They crossed icy seas in wooden ships, carrying livestock, tools, and faith. They built homes of stone and turf, carved fields from permafrost, and raised children in a land most would consider uninhabitable. To endure in Greenland for nearly 5 centuries is itself a triumph. They proved that human determination can carve life from the harshest landscapes. We see, second, fragility. For all their strength, their society balanced on a knife's edge. A few degrees of cooling, a few years of failed hay harvests, a decline in trade, these were enough to unravel them. Their cattle could not graze in snow-covered fields. Their ships could not sail through ice-choked seas. Their trade collapsed when Europe no longer wanted their ivory. They lived close to the edge, and when the edge shifted, they fell. We see, third, identity. The Norse were Europeans, and they clung to that identity with pride. They built stone churches to anchor themselves in Christendom, even as hunger gnawed at them. They buried their dead in fine garments, even as resources dwindled. They measured wealth in cattle and hay, even as seal meat became their staple. To abandon those traditions would have meant abandoning who they were. Their refusal, or inability, to adopt Inuit ways of survival was not simple stubbornness. It was a cultural choice rooted in dignity, faith, and pride. And yet, that choice was fatal. We see, fourth, silence. When the Norse vanished, they left no final chronicle, no farewell. The last written record, the wedding at Hvalsey in 1408, is poignant precisely because it is ordinary, a celebration of life at the edge of extinction. After that, nothing. The silence forces us to wonder, to imagine, to fill the void with questions. Did they die quietly, one by one, until none remained? Did a last group sail into the unknown, seeking Iceland or Vinland, only to vanish at sea? Did some slip into Inuit communities, their identity dissolving? We do not know. That absence is what keeps their story alive. But above all, we see a mirror. Their story is not just about them, it is about us. The Greenland Norse faced climate change, fragile trade networks, cultural rigidity, and the challenge of adaptation. So do we. They lived in a world where survival depended on both resilience and flexibility. So do we. Their fate is not a distant curiosity, but a warning. If we cling too tightly to traditions when conditions shift, if we ignore lessons from others, if we assume our connections will always hold, we risk repeating their story. And yet, their story is also an inspiration. For centuries, they endured where few could. They built homes, raised families, and lived with dignity in a land of ice. Even in decline, they held to faith and identity. Their story is tragic, but it is also a testament to human courage. We should not remember them only for their disappearance, but for their endurance. Let us return one last time to the ruins. Imagine standing at Halsey Church, the wind whistling through stone walls built by hands long gone. The sky is vast, the sea cold, the land empty. And yet you feel their presence. You see the bride and groom of 1408 walking down the aisle with hope in their hearts. You see farmers cutting hay in brief summers, children chasing sheep on green slopes, priests chanting prayers in Latin. You see the life that once filled this place. And then you see the silence that followed. The ruins speak, not with words, but with echoes.
When archaeologists dig in Greenland, when storytellers retell the sagas, When we sit together tonight and imagine their lives, we keep them alive. They may have vanished, but they are not forgotten. Their stones endure, their silence speaks, their story lingers. So, what really happened to the Viking colonies in Greenland? They were undone by a combination of climate change, trade collapse, cultural rigidity, isolation, and time. They were pulled apart by forces larger than themselves. And yet, they lived with dignity until the end. That is the truth, as far as we can know it. And why did they vanish after centuries of survival? Because survival is never guaranteed. Because resilience has limits. Because the world changes, and those who cannot change with it are swept away. But in vanishing, they left us a gift, a story that warns, inspires, and humbles. A story that reminds us that we too live close to the edge, that we too must adapt, that we too will be remembered not only for how we lived, but for how we faced our trials. And so, as we close this journey, let us carry their story with us. Let us remember the courage of those who built homes on ice, the fragility of societies bound too tightly to tradition, the silence of a people forgotten by their world but remembered by history. Let us look into the wind across the Greenland fjords and hear their voices, whispering still. Thank you for joining me on this voyage through time. If you have found meaning, wonder, or reflection in this story, I invite you to stay with us on this channel. There are more journeys to take, more mysteries to explore, more lessons to uncover. History is not past, it is present, alive in the stories we tell. And as you drift into sleep tonight, imagine the fjords of Greenland, the stone ruins under the stars, and the whisper of the wind carrying the voices of the Morse who once lived there. They are gone, but in our remembering they endure.